Can you buy a property at a bid X1 auction or a similar auction with a mortgage? That's a question that I'm often asked. Hey, it's Terry Gorry, and this is the Irish Law and Small Business podcast. Question that I'm sometimes asked is, can you buy a house at auction with a mortgage? And the answer is yes and no. Yes, insofar as there's nothing that would prevent you from buying at auction with a mortgage or with a loan arranged from a bank, arranged from a lender, provided the lender was on board and had given approval at the outset. But the more nuanced answer would be to take a look at some of the differences between buying by private treaty and buying at auction. Private treaty is the opposite of auction. Buying at auction, if you're the successful bidder, and the property is knocked down to you and you succeed in the auction, then you must sign the contract, you must pay 10%, and you must complete the sale. You have no choice. And therefore, there is no question of negotiating a contract at that stage or negotiating any change to the contract. In a private treaty situation, on the other hand, you would always, acting for a purchaser as a solicitor, request the insertion of a subject to finance special condition in the contract. That means that if my client is unable to obtain finance or can obtain finance, but for some reason something goes wrong between obtaining finance and drawing down the loan, then because the contract is subject to finance and because it's subject to the availability of the loan, all bets are off and the contract is rescinded. And apart from disappointment for my client, that's the worst that can happen. Whereas with an auction contract, there is no question of subject to finance. It simply won't be accepted, and therefore you must be able to deliver on completing the sale either through cash or through the mortgage that you're getting from your lender. So there are two huge differences between private treaty and auction, and that's why theoretically a lender could advance or give you an offer of a loan for a auction property, a property coming up to auction. But if your circumstances change, for example, if you lost your job, or if the COVID situation kicked up again and you ended up being laid off or something of that nature, then between the time that you've been offered the loan and accepted it and the time the money is drawn down, there is further conditions or further checks that the lender may carry out. And you may be in difficulty then if you've lost your job. And you could be absolutely squeezed between a rock and a hard place if you've been successful at the auction and if you have signed the contract, because you must complete. If you don't complete, you're going to lose your deposit and you could be sued for the balance. So that is one of the differences between private treaty and auction, and why, even though theoretically there's no difficulty, in practice it can be difficult. So what you need to do, you need to be very, very careful to firstly carry out or have carried out by a solicitor a good review of the auction contract and the title documents so that you know exactly what you're getting. Title documents would include planning and so on. Secondly, you'd want to do a structural survey on the property itself. And thirdly, you'd want to be absolutely certain that not only have you finance arranged with a lender, but that there's no conditions in there, no special conditions that might trip you up between purchasing or being successful at the auction and the completion of the sale. Another factor you need to consider is private treaty sale will involve buying a house in a housing estate or buying a house in the countryside or wherever, but it'll be two private parties engaging in a contract. Contract properties at auction tend, however, to be different. They don't tend to be your normal 3-bed semi where a family might be living and be paying a mortgage and so on. That's not the type of property that you will typically see at an auction nowadays. The Bid X1 auctions, the I Am Sold auctions, the Leinster property auctions, the Gibson auctions, all of those properties tend to be of a particular type, and a large number of them would be repossession situations, and the sales would be by receivers appointed by banks, and therefore the contracts are going to be drafted in a particular way, especially having regard for the limited information and the limited knowledge that the receiver will by definition have. And therefore the contracts will have special conditions which will be fairly protective of the receiver and fairly protective of the vendor. And so there won't be any negotiation of that contract. It'll be very much on a take it or leave it basis, and there may well be difficulties with the property itself. I'm not saying there's difficulties with all of them. You could get a bargain, but there may well be imperfections or infirmities with those properties. So you could have a repossession, or it could be repossessed. That's not the worst of it. The worst of it is you could have a repossessed property where there's a sitting tenant, and the receiver is basically saying there's a tenant in the property, we know nothing about him, we don't know whether there's a letting agreement in place or not, we don't know if he's paid a booking or a security deposit, we don't know if he's paid rent, and that's really it, So you're taking your own chances. That's a difficult situation from the point of view of buying that property with a mortgage and with a view to moving into it. So properties that are sold at auction tend to be not your normal run-of-the-mill 3-bed semi or 4-bed detached house. They tend to be repossession situations where lenders have foreclosed essentially on the property, or the property has been surrendered back and released, as it were, to the lender, and it's for sale by a receiver. In summary then, in principle and in theory, there's no reason why you couldn't buy a property at auction with a mortgage. In practice, it's much less common. In fact, I've never dealt with one, quite frankly, and I deal with mortgages every day of the week, but I've never had a mortgage for an auction property because of the particular type of property, because contracts are very much auction contracts, they're non-negotiable, and various other factors. I presume that the banks take a particular view, and I presume that many people would have gone to lenders at various stages saying that I want to buy a property and it's at auction, and I'm assuming that they were told no, we're not interested or whatever. So theoretically there's no reason why a lender couldn't advance a loan to buy at auction, but in practice I haven't seen it, quite frankly. Now, as I say, there's no reason why it couldn't happen, but auction properties, especially receiver sales, especially repossession situations, those situations are not really for the faint-hearted. They're not for a young couple looking to buy their first house. They'd be for more experienced persons who would have speculated perhaps in property before, maybe buying a property with a view to flipping it, doing it up and flipping it and turning it over and selling it on at a profit, and so on. I know one particular individual, for example, who is looking for properties that are actually damaged, because he's a small builder and he can bring a good bit of value to the table and do the property up. He's a cash buyer, he can do it up, he can fix what needs to be fixed, he can sort out pyrite and so on, and then he can sell it on and make a nice profit out of it. But that is very much a situation where that gentleman knows what he's doing, he has experience, and most importantly, he has cash. Thanks a lot for listening, and don't forget to subscribe so that you won't miss an episode. And I'd really appreciate it if you'd leave a review on Apple's iTunes. It gives great encouragement and lets me know that I'm on the right track. Thanks a lot.